Okay, so welcome into week 3 here. Few kind of little housekeeping things I'm going to mention, and then we'll get into the task list as kind of standard, just to cover what we're going to be going through this week. So kind of starting out here, if you submitted assignment 1 already, so either last week or over the weekend, I've graded all of those submissions. You should already have your grade posted on Brightspace. So this gives you a bit of sample of how the grading's kind of gonna go for this semester. Uh, I don't think I was very harsh. Uh, if you ever run into the kind of situation where you think I graded your assignment incorrectly or anything like that, by all means, bring it up to me. I'll make any necessary adjustments to your grade. I'm not always right 100% of the time. Sometimes I have a bit of a lapse and open the wrong drawing file. Maybe I'll assign the wrong grade to the wrong person. Things happen. Uh, by all means, if you think there's a mistake in the grading, you can just bring that up with me and I'll make my fixes. Okay. Uh, Aside from that as well, for those of you that did submit and have been graded already, you can see my feedback just right in the Brightspace kind of feedback for the assignment. Uh, if you have any changes that you want to do, make those fixes and resubmit it. Just submit it to the Dropbox folder again with your new drawing files. I check through there every weekend, and then I'll look through, make sure you've made your adjustments, and then update your grade. Okay? Uh, any questions right away about assignment 1 otherwise? Fairly straightforward. So, uh, kind of a little pointer, both for those of you that haven't submitted yet and those of you that have. The main kind of hitch that I was finding with assignment 1 was often in the angles. So when you're drawing your
I have no
angles,
I have no
sorry,
sound, sir.
no sound. Sorry,
I
could
can't
you
hear
repeat that?
you.
Can everyone else hear me? Any?
Yeah,
Yeah.
now I can hear you now.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. Just double checking there. Okay. So the main kind of hitch with assignment 1 was the angles. A lot of them were drawn imprecisely. I went into the kind of additional settings there and brought up the precision of your angles. So it might have shown as 27, but that was just AutoCAD rounding to the nearest whole number. Some of your angles, if it said like a 53-degree angle, I believe, on one of the shapes, you might have had something like 52.7 or 52.9 or something like that. It wasn't quite exactly 53. Now that might seem kind of nitpicky. What's the big deal, Brent? I'm only out by like 0.03 of a degree. Uh, the real kind of reason for the grading is kind of double action here. One of them is for kind of academic requirements, we'll say. I got to make sure that you understand the commands and the tools properly. So when we enter things like angles into AutoCAD, we want to type in the angle specifically. So AutoCAD registers that exact angle. So it's a bit of a check to make sure you're using the tool properly. And then when we go into the kind of industry side of things, it's also a check for when you go into industry and make your drawings, we want those to be precise as well, because it avoids kind of confusion down the line. We'll see what as these projects get progressively more complicated and more complex. When you make a slight error like that, where it's only just 0.03 degrees off, if you continually make that error, it eventually kind of cascades into being a full degree off, or maybe a few degrees off. Because if you're consistently 0.03 off and you do a series of 100 lighting fixtures, and then each one is 0.03 degrees off, you're eventually going to be 3 degrees out, right? So it's a bit of a double action kind of reason for why it might seem like I'm docking you for something really minor. It's kind of making sure that you know the tools correctly, and then also when you go into industry, they do expect these drawings to be precise to kind of avoid that confusion as well. Okay. Uh, Other than that, again, if you have any problems with your grades, if you think it was graded incorrectly, just send me an email. I'll make fixes. And if you want to resubmit, just do so through the Dropbox. Okay. So moving on here, I'm going to share my screen. And the week 3 folder on Brightspace should now be available to you guys. I just opened it about an hour ago or so. So week 3 is now open. And in here, we have our textbook chapters continue on here and the week 3 task list. There's no new assignment coming out this week, so there's no assignment in this folder. Assignment 2 will be likely coming out next week, so nothing to worry about for this week if you've already done assignment 1. Otherwise, just make sure you're kind of keeping up with the assignments there. So in the week 3 task list, I have it open here in another tab. Just kind of our standard course resources it's outlining here. So continuing on with the textbook, any PowerPoints, practice files from Brightspace, the review questions if you feel like you need to kind of brush up or to kind of confirm that you understand what's covered in the chapter. Extra practice files is a new one for this week. The first extra practice assignment is kind of available for you to complete. They've always been open. They're not like hidden or anything like that, but you'll have the tools necessary to complete it after this week. We'll kind of discuss the extra practice probably towards the end of the class today. I'll kind of do a little run once over on it. It's not for grades or anything like that. It's just if you want more practice with some of the tools, then it kind of gives you a little proto assignment to kind of work through and just kind of make sure you're up to snuff with your AutoCAD. Task 1 for this week, we're going through chapter 4. So we've gone through chapter 1 and 2 in the first couple of weeks. Chapter 3 was the project or assignment chapter. So now we're on to chapter 4. Chapter 4 is all about drawing with precision. So we're going to be using some more precision tools to make sure our drawings are nice and clear and precise. We'll be going through the chapter itself, and we'll do a few practice problems out of the chapter, 4A, 4B, 4C, and 4F. I believe D and E are kind of overkill, and I think they're not terribly relevant to us, so we'll probably be skipping them, but we'll be covering these main 4 practice problems for this week. Again, the review questions if you just need a brush up or make sure that you know what's covered in that chapter. Extra practice 1 becomes available for task 2 here, and then task 3. Depending on timing and things, we'll likely start chapter 5. We probably won't complete chapter 5, but we'll kind of dip our toes into it as well. And that will come likely Thursday instead. Okay. So today's just kind of a lecture day, or rather a lecture week. There's no new assignment really, just more practice problems just to get some more practice into AutoCAD. And again, AutoCAD isn't anything complicated. It's not a hard or difficult software to use, but it is kind of tedious at times. And building up that practice kind of builds up your flow with working with AutoCAD, so you don't have to kind of constantly Google which tools to use or look up different commands or kind of search for tools. It's all about building up that practice to kind of make it a bit more fluid when you work with it. Okay. Any questions about this week before we get started with chapter 4 here? All good? Okay, let's get started here. I'm going to quickly open up the PowerPoint for lesson 4. Okay, so continuing on here with chapter 4, drawing with precision in AutoCAD. What we're going to cover in here is a lot of our precision tools to kind of help us quickly draw things, both quicker and more precise. So we're not ever freehand drawing things. We don't want to draw things freehand without either putting in manual number inputs or using some of these precision tools we're going to talk about today. Because again, it leads to that kind of confusion. The inaccuracies can kind of cause a lot of problems down the line for us. So we're going to talk about object snaps. First of all, we have some tools that will allow us to snap to specific kind of points of interest on different shapes and objects that we draw in AutoCAD. We'll talk about override running object snaps, just a different kind of category of some less commonly used object snaps, but they're still relevant and useful. We'll talk about drawing vertical and horizontal lines at specific angle increments. We've already kind of talked about this. This was kind of related to polar snap or not polar snap, sorry, polar tracking. We kind of talked about polar tracking already. We'll do a little exercise on it, but I'm not going to kind of cover it in too much detail. We've already kind of exhausted the extent of polar tracking. We'll talk about locating new points relative to existing ones. This is object snap tracking. So we can use tracking lines in conjunction with object snaps, and we'll kind of show you what that looks like. Restricting the crosshair to specific increments. This is relative to the grid. So we can use the grid lines as kind of a precision tool, and we can force AutoCAD to use its crosshair to stick to those grid lines. So we aren't drawing between the grid lines and accidentally adding any decimals. And we'll talk a bit about how to modify the grid as well, and how that kind of appears on our AutoCAD drawing space. Okay, so we're kind of talking about object snaps, object snap tracking, and some snap and grid for today. So, running object snaps. Running object snaps are snaps that will allow us to exactly move our crosshair to specific points on objects. This is set up through the status bar in the bottom right of our AutoCAD screen. We also can open up drafting settings to set up those object snaps. It's kind of redundant, but we'll go through it anyways. And then we also have, whenever we turn on these object snaps, they're a toggle. So we either toggle them on or off. It's just a checkbox. So we can turn them on, we can turn them off as needed. And these object snaps are bound to the AutoCAD software themselves, so they span across multiple drawings. These settings, these object snaps, aren't embedded in the drawing file itself. They span across all drawings that we work on, or we have currently open. And we'll show you here what that kind of looks like. So I have my AutoCAD here. In my status bar, I have a button here called Object Snap, or Snap Cursor to 2D Reference Points. This one in the bottom right. It's a little square with kind of a smaller square in the corner. It has a little drop menu beside it as well. Just a little note again, if you ever see the down arrow, that means more options. You can either toggle it on and off just by clicking on it to show that it's active or inactive, or it has the hotkey F3 as well on your keyboard. So you can use F3 to turn it on and off as well. And what Object Snap is going to do is it's going to snap my cursor or my crosshair to specific points of interest. So I'm going to open up the little drop-down menu, and I'm only going to select endpoint for now, and we'll show kind of what endpoint's going to do for us. So I only have endpoint checkmarked. And now, if I were to draw something like a line, and I just have a straight line segment here, just a horizontal line. If I'm going to draw another line and I want it connected to this first one, what that object snap is going to let me do is if I hover near the endpoints of this line, I get a little green square that's showing me that my next point that I'm going to be creating is going to be attached to that endpoint. So as long as I see that green square, I can click and it'll make sure that this next line segment is joined to that endpoint. And then I can set that line wherever I want. And unlike using freehand, if I zoom in on that joint I just made, I can zoom in on it infinitely and it matches perfectly. Those two lines are completely joined. Unlike if I turn this back off and I were to draw this line, without object snap and I just try to eyeball it and try to get that line perfect, like that looks pretty good. Those lines look joined, but if I were to zoom in closer, I can see that they're not perfectly joined here, right? So eyeballing it only goes so far. When you zoom in, you can kind of see where the flaws are. Whereas with our object snap, I know that those two lines are precisely joined together. So with this first setting here, with endpoint specifically, this is any endpoint of a line segment. So if I were to draw a rectangle and then draw a line connected to this rectangle, any of these line segment endpoints, despite the rectangle being one object, this is on a line segment basis, not an object basis. So it's able to detect each of these corners on the rectangle as endpoints. So if I click near any of these corners, then that line should be joined to that rectangle's corner perfectly. Of course, it works with the two ends of a line as well. So any of these endpoints on these lines all work as endpoint snaps. And that's pretty much endpoint. So any end of a line segment, we can snap to that and then just make sure those lines are joined precisely. Moving on to the next one here is midpoint in my object snap list here. We also have midpoint. If I turn on midpoint, and I'm going to turn off endpoint for now, then what this one's going to do is it's going to find the middle point of a line segment, as it kind of self-describes there. So when I hover near these lines now, I get a little green triangle instead of the green square. And that's showing me where the midpoint is of that line. So now if I click while that green triangle is active, now I get a line that's perfectly joined at the midpoint of that line segment rather than the endpoint. If I were to go measure this, distance, this is 1.1669 units. If I check the bottom, it's also 1.1669 units. So it picked the perfect midpoint between these two endpoints of that line segment. Okay. So I'm going to get rid of this for now and move on to the next one in my list. Something to note here as well, the symbol itself that gets highlighted, I'm going to draw a rectangle again here. If I have now both endpoint and midpoint active, so I have endpoint and midpoint checkmarked, if I go to draw a line again, I can use the endpoint snaps and I can use the midpoint snap. So I have both active, both are usable. You'll also notice that each of these object snaps has its own little symbol, and that's to help you kind of identify what object snap is being used at the moment. So if I get near these endpoints, I get a little green square. Green square is the kind of common notation for an endpoint. If I get near the midpoint, I get a green triangle instead. So the triangle is indicating it's a midpoint. This can be kind of handy if I'm working with a bit smaller stuff. If I'm zoomed out quite far, I'm not 100% sure which one I might be snapping to here. So that symbol kind of helps me identify which snap is being used. Also, in the case where some of the snaps are very similar, that also kind of helps identify which one is currently being used. And like I mentioned, if I start a new drawing here, I have the same snaps active. So if I have the drawing 1 here with the rectangle, and I set endpoint midpoint, it's also endpoint midpoint on this drawing too. So it's kind of bound to the AutoCAD program rather than to the drawing file itself. Same if I turn on something like center point here, and then go back to drawing 2, center point's active here as well. Okay, any questions so far with the object snaps before we keep going with some of them? All good? Okay. So moving on from endpoint and midpoint, we also have center. Obviously, center is going to use the center point of a circle. So if I were to draw a circle here, to make a bit of more of a point, I'm going to use a 2-point circle so I don't define the center point of that circle in any way. If I make a 2-point circle here, and I have my center snap active, then when I use my line tool and you can see as my crosshair gets closer to that circle, a little mini crosshair, little cross, shows up in that circle. And as I get closer here, I get a little green circle for that object snap. So that's going to get me a snap for that center point. Maybe I'm connecting two circles together, anything like that. So we can snap to the center point of a circle. Of course, a center point or a circle doesn't have straight line segments, so I can't use endpoint snap and I can't use midpoint snap on it. So if I were to use endpoint and midpoint and no center point, there are no straight line segments on the circle, so I don't get any snaps. And since there's no straight line segments, it can't find a midpoint between two endpoints either. So I have to resort to using center point instead. And that gives me my center point snap of that circle. On top of center point, we also have geometric center. Yeah, we'll cover that now. So geometric center is kind of similar to center point, but what it's going to do is it's going to work for any polyline shape. So whereas center only works for the center point of a circle, geometric center will work for the center point of any polyline shape. Emphasis on polyline. If you make a shape out of just lines, it won't work. So if I do something like a rectangle and use geometric center, when I get near this rectangle, it gives me a little kind of asterisk, a little star shape in the middle of that rectangle. And that would be the geometric center of that rectangle. If I were to use polyline to draw some kind of random closed shape, it can still find the geometric center of this shape as well. So it's taking the average kind of area of that shape and finding where that center point is. Same with if I make something pretty extreme, kind of like a C shape here. It can still find, oh, I made this with line. Redo my C shape here. it can still find the geometric center. So the geometric center doesn't necessarily have to be within the shape. It's the average of where the total area of that shape is. So since these prongs hang out so far to the right, my geometric center is skewed to the right from where this kind of more rectangular left piece is. So it's not necessarily the center of the enclosed shape. It's just where the average area of the total shape is. This isn't crazy useful all the time, geometric center, but there are kind of niche cases where it does come up. Uh, just to kind of emphasize as well, only works with polyline. So as I kind of briefly showed there accidentally, if I make this shape twice, once with line, once with polyline, and I have geometric center active, this will work with the polyline shape, the one I made on the right with polyline, but it does not work with the one on the left because I made that with line. So geometric center only works with closed polyline shapes. Okay. Uh, I can't recall. Have I talked about lasso selection yet? Does anyone remember if I've talked about that just yet?
I think
You
you don't
haven't.
have to discuss that.
Okay. Just double checking. I teach chemical engineering technologies, AutoCAD as well. So I get my wires crossed a little bit sometimes. So when we're selecting objects, as I kind of briefly demonstrated there as well, if I have a lot of objects on my screen and I want to select a bunch at once, I can click and drag to make a selection area to select a bunch of objects at once, which is a bit quicker than manually left clicking on each of these line segments. One thing to kind of note here is we actually have two different ways to select objects with the lasso tool. If I click and drag to the left for my lasso, I get a green area. If I click and drag to the right, I get a blue area. Test it out. Test out the green by dragging to the left and circling, and then the blue by clicking and dragging to the right and circling. And who can tell me what the difference is between those two?
Dragging to the left, you only have to cross a portion of an object for the whole object to be selected.
Yeah. Versus the right?
You need to select the whole object.
Yeah, exactly. So, as Pierre said here, if I click and drag to the left, I get this green area. This is called the crossing window, or the crossing selection, rather. This is crossing selection. So all I have to do is cross an object in order to select it. I'm crossing these two kind of horizontal lines here, so I can select them both. With the blue selection, when I drag to the right, those two lines are not selected. What you have to do with the blue selection area is that blue selection area has to completely encompass those objects. So if I completely encompass that line, then I can select it. That's called the window selection. So clicking to the left, get green. This is crossing selection. I only have to cross or just tag objects to select them. If I click and drag to the right, this is the window selection, where I have to fill or fit that shape within that entire blue area for it to be selected. Does that make sense? Okay. So it's a bit quicker than manually left clicking on every object, especially when you go to kind of delete things or some of our editing tools. It isn't, I don't think it's explicitly mentioned in the textbook, but it's kind of something to bring up early because it's pretty handy. Okay. So continuing on here, we talked about endpoint, midpoint, center, and geometric center. We also have quadrant. So in my list here, I have quadrant. If I have quadrant on, this is going to let me snap to the quadrants of the circle. You can kind of think of this like a compass. It allows me to snap to the north, east, south, and west points of that circle. Or if you think about it like a clock, the 12 o'clock, 3 o'clock, 6 o'clock, and 9 o'clock. So when I have quadrant active in my object snaps, then when I use another tool to try to snap to this circle, I get a kind of diamond, green diamond at the top for my north or 12 o'clock position, snap. We also have a snap on the east or 3 o'clock position, the south or 6 o'clock, and then finally the west or the 9 o'clock position. So circles have slightly different snaps than our standard kind of line segments. They work on quadrants and center points rather than endpoints and midpoints as a kind of general rule. Just because circles aren't defined by straight line segments, so they have to use kind of different snaps. Okay. This can be kind of handy if you're drawing anything tangential to that circle. Like if I'm making a piston arm or something like that, and we're going to make this like 50. Oh, I have no snaps on. But making something like a piston arm might be a bit helpful. You imagine that kind of as a longer thing. Same with like the wheels on a train kind of idea, or tread on a tank, anything like that. When we're drawing lines tangential to circles, it's pretty handy to use quadrant. On from quadrant, we also have intersection. So if I turn on intersection here, wherever two line segments intersect, we have an object snap for that as well. So I have two just kind of generally crossing lines here. If I use intersection snap, it will give me a little X, a green X for intersection, and I can snap to exactly where those two lines intersect. This works with other things, like if I have a circle crossing a line, I can get an intersection on those as well. So any two lines that meet, I can get an intersection snap for as well. The next one on our list here is node. We got to talk about points first before we can use node. So it's not explicitly mentioned in the textbook as well, but back to our drawing tools, we have one more drawing tool that we kind of need to introduce here. Back to my draw panel, when I use the extended menu, I have a button down here for point. This is also the point command. You can type in POINT for point. And what this guy's going to do is when I use him to draw, I can draw an exact coordinate point onto my drawing. So rather than a line where I define end point or start point, end point, and it draws the line between them, the point tool is going to make one start point, no end point. It's just one specific coordinate point. Now this point is quite hard to see. If I select it, it's a bit better. I can see the little blue grip square there. But I can use P type, PTYPE, for point type. And if I hit enter, I get a little menu to change what that point looks like. Generally, I think these two here are a bit more common than most of the others. I'm going to set it to this one for now. We can also change the size of what this point is going to look like, either in absolute units, so 5 units in diameter for that point, or we can set the size relative to whatever my screen zoom is. Generally, kind of messy at times using it relative to screen. Absolute units is a bit more kind of standard, bit cleaner. So I'm going to set it to 0.5 or 5 unit point size, and I'm going to use this kind of symbol here to denote a point. And I'll hit OK, and I'll update my point here. And again, a point is just a coordinate, basically. It's not meant to be any kind of sort of the drawing in terms of kind of design and schematic. Obviously, it's not really visible if it's just a little kind of pinprick into our drawing, but it's a little bit of an assist tool at times. So if I go back to my object snap here, oops, and turn on node, this is going to allow me to snap to that point. So now I can snap to that point and draw lines. This can be kind of helpful at times if you have a long line segment. Let's make this 70 units, something kind of arbitrary here. If I now want to divide this line into 7 equal line segments, say I'm trying to draw lines vertically down off of this main horizontal line, and I want specifically 7 lines coming off of this first horizontal line, I can use points, and I'll turn on endpoint here to draw nodes off of that line, and those will allow me to have additional kind of snap points to draw more lines off of this first line. Because if I were to use something like the midpoint snap, I can only divide this line pretty much in 2. I could keep doing equal midpoints off of that if I were to keep breaking the line, but it's kind of tedious, kind of laborious work. So instead, let me use exact coordinates for my line here. If I start at 0, 0, let's make it 70 units long. I can put a bunch of points along this line. So 10, 0, 20, 0, 30, 0, 40, 0, 50, 0, 60, 0. And now I've effectively divided this line up into 7 equal segments, where I can use each of those node snaps to then draw my lines off of that main line.
Is that the only way to split up lines, or like
There
you can't
is
automatically set it up to be like I want to do 25% of the line and like midway and then midway the midway?
there is another way. This is just one method that just kind of comes up now. Under modify, we also have break or break at point. We'll cover these later down the line, but this is another way to break up line segments into smaller kind of portions.
Oh,
Sorry,
okay.
how did
Again,
you-
Yep,
Sorry, I cut you off, Brooke.
No worries, I'm
Go
used
ahead.
to it.
How did you turn those into targets again? How did you get that extra window? I missed that.
P type, PTYPE.
Okay.
If I
Is
just
the-
hit enter,
Is there also a way to rotate your quadrant by like 45 degrees if you wanted to on like a circle?
the quadrants on the circle.
Yeah.
I want to say no. I don't believe so. Not what I can think of immediately without going into kind of some crazy settings. By default, I'm pretty sure you can only use the kind of rows, compass rose coordinates.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm just doing the one assignment. I'm just kind of off. That's kind of curious.
Yeah.
Brent, if you don't mind, would you go back to this nodes, like how we divide the line into 7 segment?
Sure. So I'm
Okay.
going to redraw my line here. So my example line here, I'm going to make it 70 units long, and I'm going to make it horizontal, perfectly horizontal. So I'm going to start my line at 0, 0 as the origin. I'm going to specify that it's 70 units long at 0 degrees. And I use this example as kind of a proof that midpoint isn't going to solve my problem. Because if I were to use midpoint, 7 divided by 2 equals 3.5. So it's not going to work properly for dividing this into 7 segments. So if I tried to midpoint this, midpoint's active. If I were to try midpointing this, this is 35 units across. If I keep midpointing out, I'm only going to end up with even numbers. So what I have to do in this case, to divide this into 7 kind of line segments, is that when I use my point, we already have endpoints for 0, 0 and 70, 0. So I don't need to do nodes for those. I already have endpoint snaps for that. So I'm going to put nodes at every 10 along this 70 to divide it up into 7 segments. So if I do 10, 0 for the first one, that's 10 units across. That's 1/7 of the way across that line. Another one at 20, 0 for the second point. Another one at 30, 0, 40, 0, 50, 0, and 60, 0. So now I have all these divisions made up of my line. Now, if I were to extend these, I now can use the node snap. So I have node active. So now I can use these as snaps to extend out those lines. This isn't like a horribly common way to divide up lines. It's just an option that's available to you. The extra practice does use nodes as part of the drawing. Nodes are never actually like part of the drawing itself or the schematic. It's a tool to help the person, the drafts person, to draw the drawing. It's never actually like an integral part to the drawing. In fact, they don't even show up when you go to print. Which is also why point is in the little drop-down menu. It's like one method of dividing up a line. It's not like the end-all be-all. But this is just one method to kind of add in more object snaps that help you either divide up a line or kind of specify specific coordinates that you might be using often, or an object snap, those kinds of applications. Okay, does that make sense? Any other questions? Your lines aren't lining up there. Let me check here. So you're using the incorrect snap in this image. You're using quadrant, I believe. The correct snap is actually tangent in this case. We'll get into that in a minute, though. as well, for those of you that might be curious. So that kind of covers points. Again, points aren't like highly critical. If you want to use this method to divide up lines into equal segments, by all means, do that. If you want to use it as kind of an anchor point for other line snaps, by all means. It's just one method to do it. It's not kind of like the end all be all. Continuing on here then, I'm going to get rid of this. So that covers our nodes and our kind of point type and the point command as well. Last on our running object snaps is extension. An extension is going to give us quite literally an extension line or an extension tracking line for an existing line. So if I were to draw a line here that's 30 units long, just another 30 unit long horizontal line. Extension, let me make sure I don't have anything else on. Extension is going to give me the ability to extend this line while creating a bit of a gap. And I'll kind of show you what that means as well. So starting out with extension, in order to use extension, it's not immediately obvious, but if I hover over an endpoint of a line, I get a little green plus sign or a little green cross. If I move my cursor away, that green cross stays there. So unlike when I was using endpoint, for example, where I have to be near the endpoint and it shows me the little green square, when I move away, the green square goes away too. Extension shows that little green plus sign, and then when I move away, it stays there. And what that's kind of noting is that that endpoint is where my extension is going to be formed off of. Now, if I move my cursor anywhere following that kind of same axis as that line, the same horizontal distance, if I move my cursor anywhere along here, I get a green tracking line. From here, I can click and then draw my line, however I need to draw that line. And I form a gap, an extension gap, between those two line segments. And if I redo this again, I'm just going to make another 30 unit line again. If I use extension hovering over that endpoint, I get the little green plus sign. When I hover near again, I get my little tracking line. What I can do here to define how big that gap is going to be, as long as I can see that tracking line, I can just manually type in how many units that gap should be. So I've used extension, I select a command like line, hover near that endpoint to get the little plus sign, hover along that axis to get an extension line. And now if I type any number, that's going to be the number of units my gap is going to be. So if I type in 5 and hit enter, my new line segment started 5 units from the end of that previous line segment. And then I can make this 10 units and close it. So now I have a 30 unit line, a 5 unit gap, and then a 10 unit line. Extension's also kind of one of those slightly niche ones. This is a bit handy if you're doing something like a wiring diagram, and I were to kind of draw something, really quickly draft something up here. It's a bit crude. So I'm using a bunch of snaps here. In this case, so if I have something like a fuse that I need to put in that gap later after drawing my wiring diagram, then I can use extension to form that gap in the first place, and then later down the line, I can put in whatever's supposed to be in that gap. So then I can later, I kind of size this incorrectly, but I can later then fill in that gap with something like a block that I made earlier, or I can fill that in with a circle by using the 2-point circle, things like that. So if I'm doing a bunch of lines and I plan to fill in that gap later, extension can be kind of handy for that. Otherwise, extension has kind of fringe, kind of niche applications. It's not horribly, horribly common. Okay. So extensions for forming these kind of gaps, I have to be along the same axis though. So if I draw a horizontal line, my gap and then the next line are also going to be horizontal. Or well, the gap is going to be horizontal for sure. The line doesn't necessarily have to be. Because if I do extension again here, off of this endpoint, 5 units, then I can do something like this. But that gap is always on the same axis as the line it's being extended off of. This line can be vertical, it can be an angle or whatever, but that first point, that gap is always on the same axis. Okay. So we talked about endpoint, midpoint, mostly for line segments, center, quadrant, mostly for circles. We talked about geometric center for polyline closed shapes, node and extension, and intersection. Okay. So that kind of covers our common running object snaps. Any questions before we move on here about any of the snaps or any of the kind of usages of them or anything like that? I know we kind of go through them a little quick, but all good. Okay. So, let me just scroll through here real quick. Okay, so we've kind of covered our first little sub chapter here, 4.1 on running object snaps. So next, we can go on to practice 4A. So either using the PDF textbook or if you have a copy of the textbook, open up practice 4A and just kind of go through that. We'll go through it as a class as well. I'll give you about 5 to 10 minutes or so to go through it, and then we'll go through it together here.
Quick question for you.
Yep.
You have a window over top your cursor that like shows information. How do I get that?
Yeah. So you mean when I start line, it says specify first point and then the quadrants or
Yeah.
the coordinates? Okay, so that prompt there is from my dynamic input. So down on my status bar here, you should have a little button that looks like a little rectangle with a plus sign kind of up to the left of it
Yeah.
for dynamic input. That's going to toggle whether or not I have that prompt.
Okay.
If you don't, you see that button down there? You have it active there?
Yeah, I got it now.
Okay. If it's ever missing from your status bar, you just have to open up the customization menu to the far right of the status bar down here.
Yeah,
And
I
use
found
just
that.
up here.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I found I added a few more things. So.
Yeah. If you don't have dynamic input, what it does is it throws any of your typing into the command bar rather than beside your crosshair. But I find it's easier to see if it's kind of near your crosshair, so you're not constantly looking down or anything like that.
Yeah. Is there a way to set hotkeys for stuff? Like I know, like if you're using line a lot or something like that, it's like,
Yep.
can you do a hotkey for it or something like that, or like set hotkeys?
I'm gonna have to double check that I kind of remember, but it's under application menu for sure, and then options. And then I think, unless let me double check before I go crazy here.
Because it's super annoying to type line over and over again.
Yeah. The shortcut for line is L though.
Oh, well, that's handy.
Yeah. So if I just type L into that dynamic input, line is in brackets. It shows the alias, which is the other way of kind of typing it in. So in the case of line, the shorthand or the alias is just L.
Oh, okay, and then I have to enter afterwards or whatever.
Yeah, and then just hit enter.
Okay.
So if you want to call for line, I just hit L enter, and then it gives me line.
Okay, and then
L.
I think polyline would be like P.
Polyline is P line, I think. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
They get a bit weird, but you get used to them after a while. If you do want to change the alias, I'm pretty sure there's a way as well. Or well, I'm certain there's a way, I just can't remember exactly here.
Is there a way to make a crosshair bigger too?
I think so.
I was looking for that the other day and I couldn't find it.
Is it just pick box? No. Ah, yeah. So if you want to increase the size of the crosshair, it's just under application menu and then options. And then under display, the display tab here, there's a section for crosshair size.
There it is. Thank you.
Yep. Then where do we keep hotkeys? It's in here.
Yeah, most software has like a list. There's show hotkeys or
Yeah.
something somewhere.
I know they keep it hidden, which is annoying.
Yeah, I don't know why they do that on software.
Yeah.
Or is there a setting to turn on the hotkeys? Like to just show them under like stuff when you hover over them?
So when you normally hover over things, it'll give you the full command. So if I hover over line, it tells me it's line, LANE. But to check what the alias is, if I slowly type in line, starting with L, oh, wrong keyboard here, L, it'll give me the alias there for L for that line.
Okay.
Same with what's a good one? I think move. Yeah. You just kind of have to try them and see what the alias is, or you can go into the settings, kind of deep into the settings to find out what they are. So with move, if I type M, I can see that the first alias that pops up is just M, and then in brackets it says move. So you kind of have to play with them a little bit. The alternative is you could manually look up what they are, and that's under Manage, the Manage tab, and then under this user interface. And then in here we get keyboard shortcuts, I believe. Maybe not keyboard. Shortcut menus. Yeah, it would be keyboard.
I found something that said shortcut keys, but
Yeah, I think that's just like the hotkeys, like F, the function keys and stuff.
yeah, it's nothing special.
Yeah, not the commands themselves. They try to make it as painful as possible to find this stuff.
Yeah, I don't know why they do that.
Oh, just at the bottom of your commands list.
Oh yeah, right there.
Yeah. And then you can either search or then look in the menu here. So if I look for line, I get just regular line. There it is. Yeah. So we have regular line here.
Wait, 1 second. I'm still trying to find line. There it is.
Yeah. Can I change it though? Access.
There's a map. Oh, you can set up macros, which is kind of cool.
Yeah. Yeah, you could probably play in there a little bit to figure what they have. I guess command display name might change it.
Now, anything I mess up, as
Yeah.
long as I save a profile, it should punch
Yeah.
that back to the original will be good.
Yeah. It's probably safe to just stick with what they got, but if you do want to play around with it, yeah, you could save kind of a template file and then pull it up.
Hmm. Yeah, it's just annoying to type with one hand and click with the other, or like
Yeah.
that's all.
Yeah. Once you get more familiar with the commands, you have to use the mouse a little less, but there still are those commands where they're kind of cursor direction prompted. Like if I use it's a good example here. There's like offset. If I use offset and specify distances and stuff, I can do this with all my keyboard. Like I can make the rectangle with my keyboard by doing rectang and then 0, 0, 10, 10. And then I can do offset and put in an offset distance. But then I get kind of stuck here where it asks me for a specific object, and then I actually have to go to my mouse and select it. So there's like times where it kind of asks you explicitly to use your mouse, which kind of sucks, but
Yeah.
okay. How's everyone doing with 4A?
Done.
Good. Oh, one thing I should mention as well. So if we're all good for 4A, we'll go through it together. One thing I'll mention really quickly, if there's a bit of a kind of playing around with object snaps. If I draw a slightly more complicated shape here, and I'm going to just put a bunch of crap in here. So I've just made a big mess of lines. This is just an arbitrary shape. What you might run into as a bit of a problem with these object snaps is that if you have too many running at the same time, so I have like all of the ones we went over active at the same time, you're going to notice that they're going to start overlapping and kind of getting in each other's way. So if I now use line and I'm specifically looking for the intersection of the two triangles I drew there, once I kind of get near there, I get a weird midpoint, and then there's the intersection. I might accidentally get this intersection. It just becomes messy unless I zoom in on it pretty hard. So it's a bit of a kind of test, not like literally a test, but when you have a lot of these object snaps running, you kind of have to go back and play with them. You have to turn off some. I'm not using these ones at the moment. Turn them off, turn on intersection, use intersection. I know it's more handy to have things like endpoint and midpoint active at all times, but sometimes they just get in the way. So you kind of have to go back to the menu every now and then and turn some of them off, just so they're not getting in the way of each other. So that's one way to limit what snaps are kind of pushing each other's snaps around. Another way you can kind of control it a bit better is if I go into my application menu and my options. So I'm in my options menu from my application menu. If I go to drafting, the drafting tab, there's a couple little handy things for object snaps in here. First, we have the actual auto snap marker size. So the green triangle or the green square, any of those markers, you can make them bigger so they're a bit easier to see. And on the right side here, we also have aperture size. Aperture size is the kind of square size that AutoCAD's using to detect for available object snaps. So if you don't want it kind of picking object snaps that are like really far away from your cursor, you can decrease the aperture size and it'll have a smaller search area for object snaps. And then if I make this larger, there's a bigger square that it's going to be searching for those object snaps. So if you use a bigger square, it's easier to get to object snaps, but if you use a smaller square, there's less chance of them getting in the way of each other. This isn't really explicitly talked about in the textbook, I don't think, but it's kind of handy if you need to run into it. If you want to decrease the aperture size, just so it's not getting a bunch of object snaps in the way of each other there. Okay. So it's just application menu, options, and then in the drafting tab, we have these two options here. You can also display the aperture box if you want to see it. I think it gets in the way most of the time, but if you want to see where that search area is at all times, it'll be attached to your crosshair. I'll turn it on just to show. So now when I choose line, I have a little box on my crosshair, and that's showing me where it's searching for object snaps. If I turn this aperture size up really high, then you can see it's just going to go wild with whatever snaps are in there. So it's like, there's no such thing as a free lunch. Bigger aperture makes it easier to get to those snaps without you having to be so close. But at the same time, then you get over some of those snaps kind of overriding each other. Okay. So 4A, let me download it here. My files. And 4A is asking me for the fence A drawing. So I'm going to go download fence A. Probably down a ways here. Here's fence A. So I'll just download it. And I can open it up. Okay, so we're starting with this kind of shape here. There's some kind of faint green circles, but we mostly have this rectangular shape here. So it's asking me in the status bar to start with my object snap. It wants me to enable specifically endpoint, midpoint, center, and extension. It wants me to draw or start with the line command to draw a fence as shown in the picture. To locate the start point of the line, hover your cursor near the upper left corner of the house. The cursor snaps and displays an endpoint snap icon to that location. Click to start the line there, moving clockwise. Snap and click to the center of each of the fence posts. So I'm using the center of each of these little circles. These are fence posts, I suppose. So I'm going to start making my fence using endpoint on the top left here as my first snap, then center point of each of these posts, working my way clockwise. And you can see already how simple this is compared to manually figuring out what that measurement is and then manually inputting the number each time. I'm just clicking on a bunch of center points, which is a lot easier. The next one's an angle. I don't even have to specify that angle because it's center point to center point. Going down, across, and up for the last one here. And that is my fence line. Again, I didn't have to measure anything. Those circles already existed, so I was just using snaps between them. Specifically the center point snaps. Next, it wants me to, let me make sure I'm not missing anything here. Yep, that was it for the fence. Next, it wants me to draw the roof lines on the house itself. So we have a house here. We drew out the fence for the yard, I suppose. Now it wants me to draw the roof lines. So it wants me to make sure I have intersection on. And then here, start the line command again, draw a line from the midpoint on the right side of the building. Straight left to the point where it intersects on the left side. So I'm using the midpoint on the right. You can imagine this is one part of the roof here. And then this is kind of a extension of that roof. So I'm using the center point here. And I'm using intersection to define where this line I'm creating intersects with the line that exists there on the left. So that intersection snap is helping me with that perpendicular connection between this horizontal line and the left side of that house. Next, it wants me to do a midpoint from this little extension here up to that same ridge. Again, intersection is going to help me out. Obviously, midpoint wouldn't help because midpoint would be all the way out here. So intersection is going to properly give me that perpendicular line. And then finally, it wants these kind of angled lines to show where that extension comes in. So I'm using a endpoint. This can also be an endpoint. So endpoint to endpoint. And we also have on the left side, I believe this is extension. For line 4, after starting the line command, hover on the bottom left corner of the house. So using the bottom left corner, it's going to tell me an exact distance I need to use for that extension. So again, I just have to hover near it to get that extension plus sign. And then as I move away and come back, I get the tracking line. And it wants me to specifically put in 10 feet. 10 feet as that extension gap size. And then that will connect up to my intersection point at the top there. Okay, so we used an extension from the bottom left up to the beginning of where that ridge is. It told me specifically that that should be 10 feet. So I entered 10 feet for that extension gap and then just connected it up to the other center line of that roof. Okay, and then I should have something that looks like this. Any questions about practice 4A? All good? Okay, I'll give you guys a quick 10-minute break here. We're a bit beyond the halfway point, so we'll give a 10-minute break now. We'll come back at 7:27, and then we'll continue on with chapter 4 here.
Quick question for you.
Yep.
So like I've drawn some stuff,
Yep.
and I made a mistake and I realized it after I'd done a bunch of more other steps. Do
Yep.
I have to go back, or can I edit that line segment without editing everything else?
Yeah, so if you make a mistake, like say back here somewhere,
Yeah, like
I
that's supposed to
accidentally
be
made this
2.
line.
Yeah.
Something weird. I can't really undo because it would be so many commands back. I'd be undoing the vast majority of my drawing.
Yes.
What I'd have to do instead is resort to my editing tools. So under the modify panel is most of my editing tools. If say I drew something and I just want to get rid of that line segment, I can use something simple like delete or erase rather, and use erase to just select that object and remove it. If it's the case where you drew something with like a polyline, and then you can't use erase because erase uses object basis, it would select the entire line. So if I did this entire fence with polyline and I can't do that, we have cut or trim right beside it. Trim is on a line segment basis, so I can cut individual segments.
So is there like my length is wrong on this, it's 5, it needs to be 4. Is there a way I can just edit my length so it like brings everything in closer?
Yep.
Or
You can use stretch. If you select that object, you should use a different line here. It's probably easier to use the grips if it's not all. Yeah, if it's just one line segment, the probably easiest way is to use the grips themselves. So when you select a line segment, you get these little blue grips.
yeah.
If you click on the end, you can readjust the length. So I can either manually click and use an object snap to reset where that line is pointing. Or if I want a really specific length, I can press tab and then type in whatever that length is supposed to be. So if I go back here, let's draw a rectangle. Let's go back one. And say I put in only 5 here. And I actually wanted this line to extend all the way to the corner. I can click on that grip and I can use my object snaps to just snap it in place. Or when I go to stretch here, I can press tab and then type in what that length should have been. So this should have been 20. I accidentally put in 5. And then hitting enter will extend it to 20 units.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
You need me
and
to run
so-
through it again?
Yeah, I know it's all right. It didn't work the way I was wanting it to, but it's fine.
Yeah.
I'll have to redo a bunch of stuff. That's all.
Yeah. You do have to press, when you do this stretch, by default, it's asking how much length do you want to add on. If you press tab, that's what the length of the line totaled should be. We cover this in like chapter 5. I can't remember which chapter specifically. Yeah,
Okay.
chapter 5.
Oh, another question.
Yep.
Is it, how do we set up so that when we type in line coordinates, so you can go L, line enter, then you go tab 90, then your next line is going to be say 45 degrees at 4, right?
Yep.
Is it how do we set up so it's not like two 180s according to your cursor, and so it's just 360
Yeah.
no matter where it is?
So if I do like the 10 and then the next one was 45, 10. So you're saying here it's taking a negative or like a,
Yeah, so if my cursor's at the bottom of
Yeah.
the screen, it's doing like the opposite. My
Yeah,
cursor's
it's doing
at the top of
clockwise.
if my cursor's like where I want to go, it works. But it's like then I'm
Yeah.
constantly having to move my cursor. It's just like, why can't I just do a 360 circle and just type in all my stuff?
I think it might be a dynamic input thing. I'm thinking if it's a dynamic input thing or if it's changeable.
Because yeah, it's kind of super annoying because you go like, okay, I want 270, and it's just like, well, it went to 90 degrees. It's like, I don't want that.
Yeah. So no, you can put angles larger than 180 in here. So if I did put 270, it would give me the down. But now or if my cursor was then down and then I use 270 here, then it's gonna go up.
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't think you can do anything about it with dynamic input specifically.
Is there like a setting somewhere to be able to change that?
I don't think so in this case. What you'd have to do instead is if you use the command line, I think you can avoid it. So if I use command line to do my line here. Oh, let me get rid of my dynamic input. Uh,
Yeah, just I'm trying to do 4C without using my mouse, so I'm just like,
Yeah. Let me think about that.
is there like a setting with like tracking or restrictive cursor, like orthogonal? Something
No,
like that?
it wouldn't be under there because you don't need either of them to define angles. So if I have both turned off right now, but if I do 0, 0, I can still do angles right away. So
Yeah.
I don't think it has anything to do with those. Yeah, I don't think there's really a way.
Well, that's still fun.
Yeah. Apart from just like kind of being aware of where your cursor is or your crosshair is positionally, and then just making sure which numbers to put in. It's kind of a pain. Yeah. I don't think there is a specific setting for it though. 'Cause I know dynamic input's not horribly modifiable. Yeah. Yeah, I don't think it's changeable. I'll look into it and maybe update you Thursday if I do find something. But
Yeah,
yeah,
that'd be
I don't
awesome.
think at a glance. Okay. Uh, so we're at the end of the break here. We'll continue on. So next we're going to talk about object snap overrides. So these are kind of our less commonly used object snaps. So if I go back into my object snap list here, we talked about the first 3, 6, 8 or so. These last 6 are less commonly used. You can toggle them on or off, but we're going to talk about a way to kind of use them on a use by use case basis. So our object snap overrides are insertion, perpendicular, tangent, nearest, apparent intersection, parallel. We also have none as one of them. What an object snap override is that it's going to override whatever settings we have active and kind of use one specific snap. If I draw, I'm just going to draw some arbitrary lines here. Let me turn my polar tracking back on. If I have something, say, like a line here, I'm going to draw a circle too. In order to access snap overrides, and again, this is just for a use by use case basis, when you use the menu here itself, you toggle them on or off. If you only want to use them once, this is the method to do it. If I choose something like line, and I already have some existing stuff to use for my snaps here, if I shift right click, so shift on my keyboard and right click at the same time, I get this shortcut menu. And in here, I have some of my running object snaps, endpoint, midpoint, intersection, etc. But down in this last third or so here, we have our perpendicular, parallel, insert, nearest, and none. So these are generally our much less commonly used object snaps. So we usually use the snap override to just use them once. Whatever I pick from this menu, it's going to override any settings I have for object snaps that I currently have active and use just specifically the one I picked. So if I pick something like, we'll say center here, I have object snap off, pick center. Let me turn it back on. Oops. Turn on center. Or sorry, let's turn on endpoint and midpoint just to prove the point here. Using line, shift right click, pick center. I now don't have endpoint or midpoint, but I do have center point. So it overrides any settings I have in my object snap menu, and it's going to use just that one that I picked. And it's only going to use that one snap for the next thing I do. So if I draw this line now and I click to use that center snap I just selected, it's not going to let me use center snap again because it's not in my menu. And now I can go back to using my endpoints and midpoints. Okay, so this is a one-time use overriding any settings for object snap we have, and then it'll go back and revert back to our regular standard settings. So again, this is for our kind of less commonly used ones. We don't want to have things like perpendicular and tangent and nearest on all the time because they get in the way of the other object snaps. So I might commonly have something like midpoint, endpoint, center, quadrant active most of the time. If I want to use tangent every now and then I'll use line command, shift right click, go down to tangent, select it. Now my other snaps aren't getting in the way. I don't have center, I don't have quadrant, I don't have endpoint, there's no midpoint either, and I just have tangent. And then as soon as I click to determine that tangent, then I go back to my regular settings with quadrant, center, endpoint, midpoint, etc. Okay, so it's going to override any of your settings, and it's only going to use that one snap that you specified. So it's commonly used for the less commonly, or it's commonly used for the less commonly used object snaps. Okay, so going through some of these these object snap overrides, we have perpendicular. So if I choose perpendicular out of this list here, remember start with a command. I'm using line, shift right click to get into this shortcut menu, choose perpendicular. This is going to give me a little green icon that looks like a right angle. It's like an L with a little box in the corner. Now, if I determine this line should be, the line I'm about to create should be perpendicular to an existing line. This is my existing line here. I want to draw a line perpendicular to it. So I'll hover to get that snap. If I click now I can only draw lines perpendicular to that line. And then I'll just click again to specify the second point of that line. And I get a perfectly perpendicular line to that existing line for my perpendicular object snap. In the list as well, we have, we'll come back to parallel. It's a bit complicated. We have nearest. If I use nearest, this is going to pick a line nearest to one that I specify. So if I specify this line here, this is the nearest point to my crosshair. Go back here. Oops. So it's going to snap to a point on this line that's nearest to my crosshair, which is, in the case of this horizontal line, perpendicular to my crosshair, because that would be the shortest distance to the line for my crosshair. If I choose over here, this would be something like the endpoint. If I use the circle, it would be the closest point to my crosshair to that circle. Again, this is kind of a fringe case. I can't think of too many applications for this one, honestly. But if you do want to find a point that's nearest to your crosshair, but still pinned to this circle, so I want to make sure that line is attached to the circle, but I'm not too specific about where on this circle I'm clicking, then I'd use nearest, I suppose. In this list as well, we have tangent.
How do you
Using
get that,
tangent. Yep.
How do you get that when you right click there, that list comes up? When I right click it, I'm sorry, I missed that.
Yeah, so if you just kind of right click alone, you'll probably get this menu. If I shift right click, so shift on my keyboard and right click, then I get this extended override object snap menu.
Got you. Thank you.
Yeah, so shift and right click. Okay, so we also have tangent in here, so I can override to tangent. Again, my endpoint and midpoint are now inactive, and now I can choose a tangent line to the circle. So it'll start as a tangent line to that circle, and then I can make the second point anywhere, and this line will be tangential and connected to the circle. It does depend when you use this tangent override. It does depend on where you click on the circle. So if I start a line command and use tangent, if I click on the right side, on the east side of this circle, it's going to try its best to make a tangent over there. See, if I go to the left side here, it's not making a tangent on the west side. So this one is dependent on where you click on the circle. So it can make tangents perfectly fine on the east here. It's not so good at doing it on the west. So it's dependent on where you click on the circle for the tangent. Same if I use the tangent and use it on the west side, and it has a bit of a hard time doing it on the east. It expects the tangent to be somewhere where you clicked. Okay. We also have insert. Insert's going to be more handy down the line. Right now, it's not highly relevant to us. What insert does is it's going to use a, just in the menu here near the bottom, insert. Insert is going to give us a object snap point to an insertion point of either a block or text. So if you think about when you add text to a drawing, we haven't covered text obviously yet, but this will come up later down the line. If I were to add something like text here, I'm just going to type in sample here. This set of text isn't made out of line segments, so I can't use something like endpoint, midpoint, center, quadrant. It's not a defined shape, so there's no snaps on this thing. Where insert comes into play, or insertion, is that whenever you draw text, it has a little insertion point. So this little blue grip here in the corner, that's the insertion point of that text. So if I now use insertion as a object snap, and I hover near that where that top left corner was, I get that little kind of two overlapping green squares. That's indicating where that insertion point of that text is. Again, this is just kind of like a peek into insertion. You don't have to know text or blocks just yet. We're going to cover that in later chapters. But just as a heads up, a little bit of a sample into what's to come. Insertion is for text, and it's also for blocks. So if I do a block as well, I'm just going to make a really simple one here. Insert. So blocks are kind of like grouped objects that I can later recall. So I've made this one, it's just a circle with a cross through it. It's now one object or one block, and I can recall that block as many times as I want from this little menu. Again, we're going to cover blocks in like 3 chapters from now, so don't worry about it for now. But each block comes with a little insertion point, because now that all these objects are lumped together into one big object, there's no defined center point or endpoints of that block anymore. So we have now an insertion point, and that insertion snap is going to snap to whatever that point is on that shape. Okay, so it's for blocks and annotation or text. Again, don't worry about it too much right now. It's just kind of a teaser into what's to come. I'll re-bring up insertion snaps when we start doing blocks and text as well. Okay. We also have parallel and none. We'll cover none first because it's simple. If I have a circle here and I have a bunch of object snaps active, none is going to do exactly what it says. If I shift right click and choose none, it's going to just remove all of my object snaps for the next time I click. So if I choose none, it's just not going to give me any object snaps. It's going to disable them all until I make my first point, and then it brings them back again. So none effectively just disables all of your object snaps. Again, not crazy relevant. I don't know why you want to freehand a click that bad, but there might be some fringe cases where you do come up and need it. Finally, we have parallel. I'm going to draw just kind of an arbitrary angled line here. And starting a new line command, parallel is going to allow me to draw a line parallel to an existing line. So if I choose parallel here, first of all, let me make sure it's cooperating here. And it's not cooperating anymore. Parallel will allow me to draw a line parallel to an existing line. So if I choose parallel, starting with a line command here, I select a point along this line. I don't know why it's not letting me right now. Let me try something different here.
I think you have to start your line first.
Yeah, I have line parallel.
And select your first point.
Yeah, parallels are lame.
Oh, right. Yeah, you're totally right. Selecting the first point and then going to parallel. And then when I hover over the second line here, I get the two diagonal green hash kind of diagonal lines for parallel. And then as I move away here, it gives me a green tracking line to make those lines parallel. So just to kind of repeat that, if I have an existing line, start the line command, specify the first point, then use my parallel override, select the line that it should be parallel to, and then when I come back up, then it should give me a tracking line to make those lines parallel.
I think it keeps going to your
Yeah.
center point.
It shouldn't because of the override, but we'll... There we go. So I move close to get that marker. It's going to give me the little green plus sign again to indicate that that's the line I'm parallel to. And then as I move away, I get the parallel tracking line there. Okay. And then I can specify how long this line should be just by typing it in, or I can manually click along the tracking line to determine that length as well. Okay. And then these lines should be parallel to one another. Any questions about the object snap overrides at all? Okay, so we covered object snaps and object snap overrides mainly. That's pretty much it for today. We'll continue on with chapter 4 on Thursday. And then if we have time at the end, we'll start with chapter 5 as well. Okay, so if you have any questions, you can stick around. Otherwise, that's it for tonight.
Have a good rest of your evening.
Yep, you too.
Have a good night.
Yep, you too. See you guys.
Excuse me, Ben, would you mind to go back one time with this parallel? Because I'm trying to do the parallel and it's not working. Maybe I can share my screen.
Sure, I'll demonstrate just one more time, and then if you're still having trouble, I'll get you to share. Okay, so with parallel, I have to have an existing line first that my new line will be parallel to. So I have an existing line at some angle here. I then have to start a new line, specify the first point of this line. So now I have a second line that I'm making. I can't make it perfectly parallel just by eyeballing it. So I'm going to shift right click and go down to parallel. And when I choose parallel, if I get near this first line that I made, I'll get the little indication, the little green diagonal lines. Then when I move away, I should get a green tracking line. So I didn't click at all after choosing parallel. I just hovered on this line and then moved my mouse away, and then I get a
Yeah.
green tracking line there.
Yeah, that make more sense. Now I got it. Thank you very much, Brett. I was clicking and that was my mistake.
Yeah, no worries.
Yeah, thank you. Have a good night.
You too.
Sir, how can, sir, good evening.
Yeah.
How can I restore when I drawing the line, there is
Yeah.
no like degrees and measurement beside. How can I restore that?
Yep. So let me go back to AutoCAD here. So you're saying when you start line, there's
Yes.
nothing beside your cursor here. It says
Yes,
specify first
yes.
point. You don't have that.
Yes, sir.
So what toggles that on and off is the dynamic input. That's down here on your status bar.
Okay,
This
dynamic
button here.
input.
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Yep. So if you have that on, then you should have this back.
Okay, thank you. I will check.
Yeah.
Dynamic input is where did I find again?
On the
Sir?
status bar, so at the bottom right, down here.
Okay, okay. Dynamic input, I should be turn it on.
Yeah, on.
Dynamic setting. No.
Nope, just when you click on it and it highlights blue, that means it's
Okay,
on.
okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Let me try. Okay. Thank you.
Yep, no problem.
I have to go. Have a good night.
Yep, you too.
By the way, where
Yep.
where did we find this video? If
The videos?
yes.
Okay. So on Teams, this is just where we join for our meetings. On this channel here, you have posts and then also
Okay.
files. So if you go under files, then there's a folder called recordings. And this is where all the recordings automatically upload to.
Okay, sir. Thank you very much.
Yep.
I have to go. Thank you.
Okay, see ya. Any other questions before I shut down here?
Oh yeah, me.
Yep.
Points specifically, I'm having trouble opening that menu. I
Yep.
type in the P type.
Yep.
And I can't seem to open it though.
Okay, so you typed in PTYPE like this.
So I went to draw, then clicked on that multiple points
Yep.
thing with the 4 points.
The dots. Yeah.
Yeah. It just gives me a coordinate. When
Yeah.
I try typing in P type.
Yeah.
So I
So
press enter, it gives me a red square.
yeah. So when you choose the multiple points button out of the draw panel, you're in the point command. So it's asking for coordinates for where that point should be specified.
Okay.
You need it. The P type to open the menu is a different command. So POINT point would give me the points to place around.
Okay.
Right? But PTYPE, P type, opens up the menu.
Okay. So
So
it's
two
just a
separate
regular
commands.
cursor. PTYP. Enter. Okay, I got it. The menu.
Yeah. Yeah, they're two separate commands, so the menu isn't within the point command. The P type is its own separate command.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, I got it. Thank you.
Okay. Yep. No problem.
All right. You have a good night.
Yep. You too, Mark. Any other questions?